I'll just bring in another border that we want to look at, and I'll bring in our third panelist on the conversation, and that is Alma Maquitico, who is from she is the co-director of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and she has a long history of working on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. She has also helped in the build grassroots network to monitor and document human rights violations resulting from immigration enforcement in communities along the U.S.-Mexico border. Alma, thank you for joining us. And as you have already heard, at least within the Asia region, we have these two kind of borders, which are in many ways porous, and we have challenges within that. But you too have a very long border, and and I think a very long border wall as well. And I think it's still not complete based on the last reporting. And uh, what are when you look at that, the U.S.-Mexico border, can you elaborate on what are the current situation and policies that because we in the media we see a lot of the humanitarian crisis, particularly in the last year and months kind of thing, and the last report of children being separated at the borders and things like that. What are your thoughts as you listen to the first two speakers on this, on unregulated borders, and you have a very regulated border apparently. Can you share what are your thoughts on the U.S.-Mexico border, Alma?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Um, yes, we have a situation that is quite opposite of what has been described in other parts of the world. I think that the U.S.-Mexico border for many, many years has been treated historically as a zone of exception for human and constitutional rights. And this has really laid the foundation for immigration enforcement agencies that possess great powers and have no real accountability and no real oversight. So we have tremendous and very serious human rights violations resulting from this lack of accountability and quite frankly, an institutional culture of violence, that had resulted in many deaths of U.S. citizens and cross-border shootings, on the U.S.-Mexico border. And we have seen this, and we have seen, I think, since more or less 1994, the U.S. government adopting militaristic strategies, to prevent people from crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Their focus was to pursue a strategy that's called prevention through deterrence, which mainly was directed at militarizing the traditional corridors where migrants cross, pushing the migration flows away from cities or main points of entry, and pushing communities who are migrating into the wilderness, trying to use the topography of the area to kind of prevent people from crossing. This really resulted in a human rights and in humanitarian crisis. We have seen, we have accounted officially for more than 10,000 people dying at the gates of the United States or inside the United States, people who are migrating, who are dying of dehydration or from heat strokes, from being exposed to the elements. And the organizations that work with migrants that have been searching for migrants to be rescued or searching for the disappeared, they calculate that for every migrant that they find, there are at least 2 migrants that are disappeared. So potentially leading to the number of migrant deaths to about 30,000 people that in the last or since 1994. At the same time, the U.S. government has pursued different strategies to deter people from coming to the U.S. So one of them is deterrence at the U.S.-Mexico border, but they have also pursued other operations and other ways to deterring people from coming to the U.S. And one of them is utilizing the courts to prevent migrants from coming, and that has been uh, operationalized by removing due process rights of migrants who have crossed the border. So migrants are being prosecuted for illegal entry or illegal reentry, oftentimes with no real due process rights. So they've been tried in mass, a whole process that takes a long time, to review the case, to screen migrants, to interview them, to try to figure out what their case is. It really reduced to a few minutes by bringing a lot of people, maybe up to 80 people in one a court, in one trial, and many of them really pleading guilty and being deported, or some of them, have to endure imprisonment for having crossed the U.S.-Mexico border for a second time. The other way in which the U.S. government tries to deter people from coming into the US is utilizing the detention system to punish migrants that have managed to cross the border. Uh, and in this started uh, way before Trump, so we cannot just assume that the crisis on the US-Mexico border really started with the Trump administration. But prior to the Trump administration, there were detention centers that were created exclusively for families. Uh, I believe there were about 1,000 people in custody, more or less, according to official accounts. Families that were detained into family detention centers. But when the Trump administration took office, that number exploded from 1,000 families to more than 100,000 families being detained. We The other way in which the U.S. government prevents people from coming into the U.S. is by systematically undermining the asylum process. And this was operationalized by passing the migrant protection protocols, which really push people who were asking or claiming asylum, instead of coming to the US as it was traditionally the process. You arrive to the port of entry and you request asylum. But now the US government deployed officers to the middle of the bridges, not allowing people to actually come into the US, but pushing them to be in some type of international limbo, and push them to stay in Mexico and to ask for their hearings by staying in Mexico. That push between 60,000 to 70,000 people to remain in Mexico waiting for their asylum cases. And Mexico has confronted for many, many years a situation of violence, a situation in which many people have been killed and disappeared. And so many people seeking asylum had to be waiting under those circumstances. So all of
Alma,
those.
can I come in here and listening to what you are saying, and it's so different from what again Shishti and Reiko have said. Obviously, your border looks like, at least the U.S. border looks like there's a lot happening at that border, aside from people just crossing and getting into into a country of destination. You have talked about death and disappearances, and the numbers are huge. You have talked about how the border has how courts are being utilized, and that there is no real access to justice in that sense because the hearings are done at a scale where there is no real hearing. You have talked about where borders are supposed to be facilities that could be hospitable in some instances, at least to asylum seekers, that is now being curtailed. So when we then look at the three speakers, all three of you who have spoken on these kind of long borders, yours is also the most resources are spent. Is there an idea of how many, in terms of numbers, like to manage this border? What is the kind of resources that is spent to keep people out?
Uh, I have those numbers somewhere in here. I could certainly provide them before the end of the presentation, but we know that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection is probably one of the most resource biggest enforcement agency in the history of really humanity. No, there may be other border control agencies that have the amount of billions of dollars going into the military infrastructure, but certainly
All
we're one of the top ones in the world.
All right. Shishli, I'd like you to think about this as I go to the next speaker. You've heard Reiko and you've heard Alma, who talk about border situations similar like yours, but they do talk about regulation at their borders as well. And one, in the case of the US, a very highly, almost militarized kind of border, and then you have a kind of regulated border but still lack of protection in some ways of rights of migrants, although the labor rights can be there is a possibility of ensuring labor rights. I would like you to think of it then in your context and with the Nepal border, again come back to that question of what would be the way to ensure Nepalis going across to India for work, how would, how when you talk about regulation, what are you thinking in terms of regulation? But I'll give you time to think about that before